The Fourth Authority by Dr. Alon Giladi. Chapter 1. Why the Fourth Authority? Conceptual Framework. First Gate. From the Rights of the Individuals. 1. Due to the lack of a clear institutional conclusion to the problem of social gaps in Locke's second treatise. General.
The Fourth Authority discusses that same field, requiring protection due to the conceptual state of nature, in which Locke began to contemplate, but did not find room to expand from the applied aspect, namely, the inequality between human beings in accumulated property, not according to need, but according to the desire for power, even before the formal social contract was made. If the conceptual motives or reasons for Locke's work could be summarized, I would see them as a brilliant continuation of Spinoza's preliminary proposal regarding the liberties found in the hands of man in the state of nature, and the democratic derivative for the protection of natural rights within the political framework. Simultaneously, Locke's analysis constitutes a clear defiance against the institutional conclusions, as well as the assumptions of the father of realism, Thomas Hobbes, within the framework of justifying the ousting of King James II, who advocated governmental absolutism, and the crowning of King William II as a distinct constitutional monarch. Out of his struggle with Hobbes's Leviathan absolutism, within the framework of the Glorious Revolution, Locke was required to provide a more advanced conceptual design of the state of nature necessary for understanding political government and the conclusions derived from it regarding the principles stemming from man's transition to a consensual society. The state of nature was no longer perceived as total chaos, a war of all against all, but specifically as a state in which man obeys the command of his reason through self-restraint and universal mutual respect for natural rights. And yet, since not everyone behaves properly, the solitary individual found it difficult to protect his natural rights, which stem from himself and are not the fruit of an external grant, not a covenant, not a contract, and not even a law of nature, but a natural right. These rights are composed of the right to life, to liberty, and to property. The difficulties in the state of nature, which stemmed from man's tendency to violate the natural law, were defined by Locke as the absence of a human law for protection against this violation. The absence of a judge known to all, who is objective and unbiased, and the absence of the ability to execute the judgment and the law caused the solitary individual to be forced to decide for himself the rules, beyond the natural law, according to which he would act in defense of his liberties, the sanctions against violators, and even their execution. These needs of the solitary individual caused many difficulties in the protection of his property, because of which man transferred the right to the protection of these rights from himself to society, to the regime. This is as distinguished from Hobbes's opinion, according to which the rights themselves were transferred to the regime. Therefore, the individual himself is the sovereign. Therefore, a regime that does not fulfill its duty toward the people, the sovereign, to protect the property of the individual, it is appropriate that it be replaced. Furthermore, the desired regime is the one based on laws originating in the people, and it is built from three authorities that answer, within the framework of the contract, the needs of man: the legislative authority first and foremost, the executive, executing toward the interior, and the federative, executing toward the exterior. However, the primary state of nature, according to Locke, was also a state of equality, when every man had property in an equal way and according to his needs. Even if man desired to take beyond the measure of honesty beyond his needs, it was of no utility because property was perishable by its nature. The use of means of exchange that are non-perishable and can be accumulated beyond man's needs, such as money and gold, originates in the later state of nature or in the pre-contractual stage, when it was agreed by silent agreement or by habit on the use of these means of exchange, and it is the basis of social gaps. Material inequality originates, therefore, in the desire of man to accumulate more and more property, which was made possible through money beyond his natural needs, as distinguished from the inequality in the quality of property given to his disposal, which stems from labor and talent. However, beyond the diagnosis of this inequality, Locke does not specify the practical derivative for this situation, that is, the means to abolish or reduce it. This is despite the fact that he explicitly notes that this is a situation that is not positive. This situation is so negative in his eyes that it contradicts natural law, which dictates that every man should possess property only to the extent that he can make use of it. His institutional reference in this matter is summed up in a short and general remark, according to which the legislative authority must care for the deficiencies in the security and welfare of the individual stemming from this aspect of the state of nature. Admittedly, the accumulation of property out of desire beyond man's needs is an unfair measure, a desire and not a thought of reason, and causes conflicts and quarrels. But Locke settles for the determination that the role of the legislative authority is the preservation of property, in the sense of abolishing the state of insecurity and lack of welfare created in the state of nature. How the abolition of the lack of welfare will be done, and what is its practical meaning in the context I am discussing, all these do not receive a clear answer, but rather, as stated, a general reference according to which the primary authority, the legislative, has the duty to act against the lack of security and lack of welfare alike, which characterize the state of nature. This deficiency in Locke's thought did not escape the eyes of scholars, and some even saw fit to harness it into a critical and even defiant interpretation of Locke and his motives. Thus, for example, Macpherson argued that in the reality of Locke's day, the working class did not possess full political rights, and even could not, since workers, according to Locke's method, did not live full rational lives, that is, a life of liberty and the acquisition of property through labor, but lived at their employer's table or through charity, because they had no property through which or in which they could develop by their labor. From here, the way was not far to the conclusion that the protection of the individual's property, according to Locke, means protection of the bourgeoisie class, or the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie within the framework of the capitalist system. I believe that this interpretation of the deficiencies in Locke's teaching is flawed, not only from a historical philosophical perspective, but also from the perspective of a proper analysis of the second treatise. Locke, after all, does not accept the state of inequality as desirable, and does not even argue that inequality concerns only those who have property. In his view, this is a problematic and invalid phenomenon, originating in the desires of man, which stems from the accumulation of what is beyond his needs, and whose implications are quarrel and strife. It cannot be assumed that Locke sought to perpetuate what he sees as a severe and invalid matter. A more appropriate interpretation would be that Locke did not in practice address the implications of economic inequality, since this was not the focus of the interest that required a solution in his time, both because it concerns the pre-industrial period, and because before him stood the problem of establishing the framework of the democratic liberal state against the aspiration of the old absolute regime to continue to exist. As such, it is appropriate to assume that the absence of a solution to the problem raised brilliantly by Locke, as with other thinkers, was intended for a solution to come in times to come in the future. My first hypothesis will therefore be that the fourth authority is the applied response to that same missing answer, which, by the nature of things, the period and its needs, did not stand at the center of Locke's thought, but it is certainly a natural and clear derivative of his views and the rationale standing at their base. Simultaneously, I will address counter-arguments according to a different analysis of these views of his, including the conclusions stemming from these analyses and their implications regarding the fourth authority.
Locke and the institutions derived from the state of nature. Equality is not a basic right requiring protection by a separate institution of the fourth authority's type.
It seems that a first possible argument against the claim raised in this chapter will focus on the foundations of Locke's theory in this context, namely, on the reasons for the establishment of the social contract in the protection of basic rights. According to this argument, equality is not a basic right requiring protection by a separate institution of the fourth authority's type, and therefore one must settle for the existing institutions derived from the basic rights requiring protection. The social contract toward which Locke aims comes first and foremost to protect the natural rights of man in the state of nature which face danger, or more precisely, a difficulty when the protector, the legislator, the executor, and the judge in their matter is the individual himself. This agreement between human beings who transfer their property to the authority of the community and its institutions places simultaneously for their protection the three authorities: the executive, the federative, and first and foremost, the legislative authority, which expresses their wills. They give it the power to care for their affairs out of this social deed of trust, and therefore it is appropriate that every correction be discussed, and every injury to these rights, if it exists, be solved within the framework of that same legislative authority. The first claim against the research hypothesis subject of this chapter will therefore be that the accumulation of property and the inequality derived from it do not in themselves, and certainly not in a reasonable proportionality, negate those natural rights for which Locke required protection. And therefore, the solution to this matter, if at all, does not lie in the establishment of an authority different from the one proposed by Locke, let alone in the addition of a fourth authority as claimed in this work. The reason for this is not because Locke leaves this matter without an institutional response. On the contrary, for he notes, albeit in a general way, that the legislative authority is the one required to be discussed regarding the welfare of the members of society. It must be assumed, therefore, that according to his method, if a situation exists that requires correction, then the initiative and the act for this must be done by that same authority expressing the needs, the wills, the desires, and the mandate of the public. If this authority does not find it fit to change an existing situation, even under the assumption that change or its absence is not immediate, but spans over a suitable period for drawing conclusions on the authority's functioning in this matter and the will of the people which receives expression in its election, then it will be implied that the public is not interested in such a change, and so on. It is evident that as distinguished from a natural right which is indivisible and inviolable, the accumulation of property in an unequal way originating in agreement, whether from explicit will or from silence, is not a natural right, beyond the property required for a man's existence. And therefore, it has both positive and negative aspects alike, and not quasi-absolute aspects like the natural basic rights, life, liberty, and property. It is possible that it constitutes a certain part or a certain source of conflicts originating from man's desire for power, but there is in it also a possibility and a desire for development that is beyond the narrow confines of perishable property, in accordance with the nature of man who desires life, liberty, and property, to expand his horizons, to trade, to set out for new discoveries related by man's nature also to matter. For if there was only evil in the accumulation of property, or mainly evil in the sense of injury to the natural rights of man, then it is not reasonable that man would take those same liberties which he sought to protect within the framework of the state of nature discussed in Locke, and whose subject is the protection of that same accumulation of property that proceeded in a conceptual way as an implied agreement to that same explicit social contract. The conclusion from all these is that according to Locke, there is no place or derivative from the state of nature, and even from the state of inequality, originating from the accumulation of property for the establishment of a separate institution for the solution of the problem of social gaps created because of inequality, and that the interest of man, as far as it concerns problems that do not harm his natural rights, let alone in problems concerning these rights, is that they be solved within the framework of the legislative authority expressing his will and the mandate he gave in a free manner for the purpose of protecting his property. I cannot accept this answer to my claim. The reason is combined. The defense of equality is not a defense of a right per se, but a cross-cutting defense preventing the negation of rights. The combined danger, evil nature, and accumulated capital. If in the original state of nature, which preceded the material inequality resulting from the accumulation of property, there arose a need to establish institutions due to the evil side of human nature, envy, desire for power, etc., then there is a far more complex and modern need today. We now stand before a combined danger. 1. Human nature, the original selfish impulses described by Locke. 2. Accumulated power, a force that did not exist in the pure state of nature, the power of accumulated capital. This wealth grants increasing control over others and disproportionate influence over the shaping of society. This power allows a specific sector to shape a privatized state that sheds its social responsibilities in the name of free competition, a competition that is only possible for those who already possess the means to compete. This is a danger centered on material property in the sense of a lack of equal opportunity to create the minimum conditions that allow a person to improve their environment through their labor. Over time, as gaps widen, this threat spills over into a danger to the individual's liberty and even to the preservation of life itself, such as the inability to afford health care or basic needs. The institutional void. This combined danger requires a structured, parallel, and perhaps even more rigorous institutional defense, one that is simply not found in Locke's 17th century writings. While I analyze Locke within his historical context, as suggested by Ashcraft and others, the ambiguity in his chapter on property highlights a Lockean institutional lack that has yet to be cured. Locke's work is structured around problems requiring institutional solutions. If he emphasized a state of nature where opportunity is equal and property differs only by talent and labor, he could not have intended to leave the subsequent monetary state, which creates vast inequality, without an institutional check. Philosophers often leave certain issues for future generations, especially when those issues deviate too far from the immediate concerns of their own era. Restoring the true and original government. Locke does not hide his unease regarding the accumulation of non-perishable property. He places it on the table, emphasizing that the equality of opportunity is a threshold condition for the very establishment of his primary institutions. If the institutional structure allows for the preference of one sector or fails to adapt to the flux of things in the world, it loses its legitimacy. I conclude with Locke's own brilliant observation regarding the necessity of institutional reform when the reality of society changes. Things of this world are in so constant a flux that nothing remains long in the same state. People, riches, trade, power change their stations. For it being the interest as well as the intention of the people to have a fair and equal representative, whoever brings it nearest to that is an undoubted furtherer of government and must have the consent and approbation of the community. Salus populi suprema lex is certainly so just and fundamental a rule that he who sincerely follows it cannot dangerously err. Locke, Second Treatise, sections 157 to 158. Therefore, the claim that there is no room for a separate institution regarding equality because it is not a natural right does not hold. The fourth authority is the natural, modern application of the Lockean rationale to ensure that the supreme law, the welfare of the people, is maintained in the face of modern economic shifts.
On extreme situations, the natural state, and the fourth authority. The problem of social gaps is not in itself an extreme problem necessitating an institution separate from those existing naturally.
A counter-argument to the claim brought at the end of the previous chapter would be that Locke does, in fact, refer to situations of exploitation and oppression from a societal perspective. But in his view, these require a radical institutional solution only when they reach a certain level and not in the desired course of daily life. Since the problem of social gaps is not an extreme problem, certainly not in Western society, there is no room for a drastic solution like the fourth authority, which implies a change in the structure of the regime. This seemingly stems from a reading of Locke's references to situations where there is a need to change the system of government or replace it through revolutionary means. These things are also true in another situation where there is no act of the prince contrary to the laws. A situation where a legislative authority exists, but the owners of property or another sect control it and channel its decisions and actions to their own benefit, while exploiting and oppressing the weak. This possible state of affairs, characterizing the dissolution of government, is seemingly created under legal consensual conditions, but it is illegal insofar as it harms fundamental rights and creates a state of war between the sovereign and the people, necessitating the latter to take up the same defense that is the right of every man in his natural state. However, even this extreme argument does not hold in our case. As distinguished from the path of tyranny and the non-fulfillment of laws by the ruler or the ruling class, there is another path leading to the dissolution of government that justifies change, and that is when the legislators or the prince act contrary to the trust reposed in them. This defense is proper and legal when the misdeeds of the government are carried out toward the majority of the people, or when the consequence of their actions is a danger to most of them, to their lives, their assets, their liberty, and perhaps even their religion. This state of affairs, in which the legislators or the prince act contrary to the trust reposed in them, as they attempt to harm the property of the subject and elevate themselves or any part of the community to the level of masters acting by their arbitrary will regarding the life, liberties, and property of the people, creates an exemption regarding obedience toward that sovereign. Whenever the legislators endeavor to take away and destroy the property of the people, or to reduce them to slavery under arbitrary power, they put themselves into a state of war with the people, who are thereupon absolved from any farther obedience. The power devolves to the people, who have a right to resume their original liberty, and, by the establishment of a new legislative, such as they shall think fit, provide for their own safety and security, which is the end for which they are in society. What I have said here concerning the legislative in general holds true also concerning the supreme executor. Locke, 1997, page 166. Thus, we see that Locke refers to the state of inequality and the possibility of establishing a legislative authority and even an executive authority that are different from those existing as a result of the needs of the state of nature. And yet, it can be argued that these concern extreme situations, for example, an attempt at absolute rule or the governmental tyranny of such or another class. That is to say, in extreme situations where the oppression and exploitation against most of the people are so blunt that there is no escape from replacing the regime, whether through actual violence or in another way. A counter-argument to the research hypothesis in this context would be that, with all due respect, despite all its deficiencies, at least the alleged ones, this is not the state of Western society. A radical change, certainly of the type Locke discusses, is not the point. This society, at least in relation to the rest of the societies in our world, is considered the most advanced in terms of conditions and life opportunities for its citizens. And even if it contains deficiencies requiring correction, as claimed in this work, they do not reach the level reviewed in Locke's arguments above, if only for the reason that the state of society in this context is immeasurably better than that which existed in Locke's time, who himself did not propose to change the society in which he lived with a change of the type proposed here. Furthermore, this discussion by Locke is not in the natural state, but in the need for institutional change due to the improper development of the conduct of the government stemming from the natural state. Therefore, according to this argument, there is no ability to rely on this analysis within the framework of the claim that from the natural state, according to Locke, a different division of social institutions is required, including the fourth authority. This argument as well can, in my opinion, be inherently refuted. Once we assumed, based on the basic assumptions of this work, that an expanding problem of social gaps and practical control by a specific socio-economic class exists, then the conditions for a structural change are met if the problem is not solved through existing institutions, let alone if they are effectively controlled and decisively influenced by the class of wealth owners. Even if we do not require esoteric arguments in this matter and guesses regarding his hidden intention, there is no doubt in my eyes that according to Locke, In a situation matching the basic assumptions of this work, there is room for structural change that is not limited at all to an extreme means regarding an extreme situation, such as that of a totalitarian tyrannical rule. The fourth authority does not concern a change of the government system through a coup, whether quiet or not, but through a democratic path and from within the democratic tradition alone. Without addressing the arguments of the period and Locke's reference to the defects in the society in which he lived as described above, the need for the establishment of the fourth authority stems from the combination, which did not escape Locke's eye, of human nature itself, which in itself constitutes a danger in the ideal natural state to man's property, and a source for the establishment of the legislative authority, together with the power granted to him due to the accumulation of wealth and its influence on the expansion of gaps in equality of opportunity and the minimum conditions of the citizens. Locke himself actually distinguishes between situations of acting by force of arms against the government and a change made in a different way, which is certainly legitimate, especially when it seeks to restore to the social contract its purpose, that is, the preservation of property, life, liberty, and assets, once the representatives of the public do not do so. The combination of the will to power with the ability within the framework of the contract and the legislative authority for the inexhaustible accumulation of wealth, which necessarily comes at the expense of man's equal opportunity for basic property and in practice for liberty, teaches us that Locke's basic answer is insufficient and must be expanded while creating an additional institution, corrective from the outset, the fourth authority. However, and in order to stand within Locke's foundational principles, there is no doubt that from his perspective, this authority must be part of the legislative authority, one that will add to its moral and legal power alike in a way that will provide a stronger, more proper, truer defense of the integrated basic rights of man. There is also no doubt that this authority must not harm the other basic rights, especially because it is an authority that brings with it a correction for the protection of the basic rights, a correction stemming from the needs of progress of the rational man, which are necessarily related also to his material development.
2. Due to the need for a clear institutional conclusion for solving the problem of social gaps, according to the discussion regarding the arguments against state intervention where there is no injury to liberty, according to Mill. General.
The need for the protection of individual liberties, rooted in the state of nature, led to the first social contract and to the conceptual and practical establishment of liberal democracy as a balance between the desires of individuals and their sum with the general will. However, Locke's theory, which offered an answer from above to the problem of the glorious revolution as a derivative of the natural state, left difficult question marks regarding the distributive aspects of general and private property following the creation of conditions of inequality in society, which he himself recognizes in their negative aspects in the second treatise. And all this without drawing conclusions regarding the extent of the state's influence due to these aspects, a thing which constituted an opening for state intervention in the life of the individual in the name of the common good. As an intellectual liberal central response to this problem and the derivatives likely to develop from it, which seemingly do not match apparent classical liberalism, the theory of utilitarianism arose and grew. In this chapter, I will discuss, in the context before us, the thought of one of the prominent thinkers, if not the most prominent, and summarizing of the theory of utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill. Here, I will argue that Mill, recognizing from within this theory the problem of social gaps as the severe problem of capitalist democracy, sought to bring it to a complete solution, subject to the principles of utility and liberty, mainly within the framework of civil society, while aspiring for a minimal intervention as far as possible of the state and its authorities and its dangers. As such, Mill avoided addressing in depth the prevention existing in achieving a solution to the problem placed at the doorstep of civil society in a reality of control by the elites of wealth owners. The fourth authority, as a proposal for changing the state structure, is located exactly at the middle point where the basic principles of utilitarianism and liberty converge and balance with the needs of reality, as will be clarified below. The utilitarian thinkers of the 18th and 19th centuries saw fit to place at the center of the foundations of society not the state and natural law, and in parallel, not an a priori reality from which inferences can be drawn, but an empirical diagnosis of man and his needs. Private interest, the earthly needs of the rational individual as such, from within himself, which are summarized generally in the search for his happiness, his liberty, the multiplication of his pleasure, and the reduction of his suffering, constituted the foundation and infrastructure for the conduct of society. Attention was now directed from a general deductive theory whose source is divine rational and its continuation human rational, to a theory whose source is seemingly entirely in man himself. John Stuart Mill is the prominent and summarizing thinker of this theory. I do not see room to address in this work the dispute regarding the contradiction or the completion between the main parts of Mill's theory, namely utilitarianism and liberty in the sense of limitation, but rather the institutional implications of his integrated view in the context of social justice, a plane that is seemingly problematic from the very starting point of his theory, at least regarding its distributive dimension. Mill's opinion is fundamentally opposed to the principles of the social contract and its harbinger, John Locke. For him, it is a fiction from which no conclusions for the structure of society should be drawn. That is to say, the starting point for the social arrangement is not a general a priori state and general needs derived from it, and certainly not a general will perceived by him as one of the great social evils due to its practical translation and its anti-democratic implications, but rather the individual's interest, that is, the ideas and deeds leading to the maximization of his pleasure and the reduction of his pain. The preservation of the individual's liberty against the other and the state is also derived from the fundamental utilitarian principle, and hence the state has the right to intervene in the individual's affairs, meaning to harm his utility, only when these concern the affairs of the other and involving injury or harm to the utility of the other. Mill was aware that an extensive use of this argument might emasculate free utilitarianism and the right to private property, which stands at the base of liberalism, for it can be argued that every action of man concerns the other to one degree or another, such as, for example, misuse causing damage to those earning their livelihood from it, and reducing the general property of the public to a greater or lesser extent. Therefore, he seeks to define in a narrow way that only when these acts lead a person to a betrayal of his clear and moral duty toward the other, and the injury is clear, or its danger is clear, and not just in the nature of a fear, only then do they exit from the cases concerning their owners and justify intervention by the state in his affairs. Hence, it follows that if free trade is the most effective means for the care of others and for the quality of commodities in the economic sphere, then regardless of the issue of liberty, it is appropriate that the government should not set prices. Yet, at the same time, there is legitimacy for public supervision wherever free trade might lead to injustices toward others. For instance, in defrauding the public by lowering the quality of goods, or in failing to care for the social conditions of workers. Mill, 1966, page 178. It follows that a person should be free to act as they wish in matters concerning themselves alone. However, the state, which values their liberty in matters specifically concerning themselves, is simultaneously obligated to stand guard and supervise their use of any power of attorney it allows them to have over others. From this is also derived the state's duty to intervene regarding injustices, the tyranny of husbands toward their wives, and even to demand and decree with full force that every citizen born within it shall receive a decent education up to a certain degree, including covering all educational expenses for those who have no one to pay for them. Mill, 1966, page 99. It emerges then that the fourth authority does not stand in contradiction to Mill's arguments regarding the utilitarian protection of individual liberty in itself. Its foundations lie in a clear and contemporary social situation where the majority of the population does not benefit from, and indeed lives in, lack and pain. The proposed intervention to correct this situation does not replace recognized liberal institutions such as the free market, but exists alongside them as a check, as a correction, and as a way of balancing the main center of power. Mill views such elements as having importance specifically regarding the principles of preventing the arbitrary rule of the majority. Mill, 1958, pages 208 to 209. The proposed fourth authority would operate, for example, within a fixed budget as a constitutional percentage of the total income and/or the total budget, compete for surplus funds with the executive branch, and be elected by the people. Therefore, it has the capacity to increase the lacking liberty of most individuals in society without aiming to abolish the operation of the free and competitive market, and without acting without balances to transfer the surplus wealth of the few individuals to the many, except insofar as it is accumulated not through inheritance or in a manner that clearly and substantively harms the utility of others. It seems that the substantive criticism which this chapter will address in Mill's thought will concern those institutions that do not harm liberty, where the question is not about stopping the acts of individuals, but about granting them help instead of letting them do the same thing themselves. This chapter, like the previous one, will examine where the maximization of the individual's happiness and the minimization of their pain are to be found within the context of utilitarian theory. Mill seeks to locate his solution to the problem of inequality within the framework of civil society. For example, in education provided through parents or private corporations, or through corporations of equal capital workers in ownership of industries who elect the factory management from among themselves. However, as distinguished from Locke, who presented the problem but not its practical solution through the state, I will argue here that Mill, who seeks with all his might to avoid state intervention, encounters a reality where, in the absence of a substantive institutional arrangement within the state, there is no practical possibility of avoiding the opposing influence of the capital elites. This reality may find its solution, without harming Mill's basic arguments, through the fourth authority. Mill sees three arguments against government intervention when it comes to benefit those who lack or have not, that is, where there is no deprivation of liberty. One is because the thing will be done in the best manner by individuals than by a government, such as, for instance, with one who has a private interest in the business in question. But this argument is cancelled by himself, since the issue is not regarding the regular course of the private market economy, but in helping another. A second argument is that although generally private people are not as capable as government officials to manage a known action whose subject is the fellow man, nevertheless, this action will give a push to the development of the spiritual talents of the individuals until they become proficient in the matter in question, such as, for instance, in business of industry and charity institutions managed by volunteers, in the nature of the special training of the citizen who exits the circle of private and family selfishness and the development of the habit of deeds for the benefit of the whole. Beyond this, the action of volunteers will possess a thought open to innovations and multifacetedness compared to the multifaceted way of government actions. At this point, I would like to argue that the fourth authority does not contradict the existence of those organizations or the ability of civil society to promote matters of this type, which has been proven, unfortunately, and in a natural way, in my opinion, as limited and ineffective on the general consequential level. The fourth authority does not come to abolish voluntary actions, which cannot be devoid of any intervention in the field of helping another, precisely because of the fall of the first argument, but to encourage them as an important addition to the action of concentration, supervision, and operation by society itself, as a assisting, supporting, and encouraging center for these positive organizations and deeds, which will constitute a complementary foundation to its activity. Beyond this, and in accordance with the contradiction of the first argument, it is appropriate to argue that the existence of the fourth authority is a necessity of reality, precisely because the knowledge and interest of the individual in promoting his own business are not like his knowledge and will in promoting the distress of others. Placing mutual aid on the basis of civil society alone means in practice the control of socio-economic elites also in this field, with all its implications. As for the third and decisive argument for the limitation in question, that is, the magnitude of the evil for a longer term originating from a dangerous increase of the government's power, where there is no necessity for it, lacking utilitarianism, which is liable to harm eventually the matter of elections, it can be argued that the fourth authority arises out of necessity. But at any rate, just as it will constitute a required balance to the utilitarian executive authority, so too its own action, which will be anchored in basic legislation, will be under external supervision and checking by the other authorities, and internal from its own composition, as will be detailed in the practical chapter. Beyond this, there is in its establishment no intention to concentrate the means of production and the property in which there is public interest in the way of the old proposals, and its action will add liberty to the vast majority of individuals, which they lack according to the existing structure.
Mill and the general utilitarian meaning of helping others in the present.
There is no doubt that Mill does everything in his power to prevent the influence of the state on society for combined reasons of utilitarianism and liberty, as he interprets them in accordance with the theory of utilitarianism. There is also no doubt, in my opinion, that the need to dedicate the concluding chapter of his main and celebrated essay on liberty to the issue of state action for the help of the individual, which does not harm individual liberty, but seeks to be of help to it, at least in the immediate term, as well as the ending of this chapter, which he dedicates to the Board for the Relief of the Poor, teach of the logical difficulty which Mill does not ignore but finds hard to solve, found within his theory which relies on one and only fundamental principle. When the basic assumption, according to which one must focus on the pleasure of the individual and his happiness, encounters a theoretical, let alone a continuous practical reality in which the individual, the majority of individuals, is not happy, according to the definition of his happiness in the theory of utilitarianism and in accordance with the basic assumptions in this work, then the role of the entire society stands in its full force, whether through the state or in a civil manner, to act at least for basic conditions, if not more than that, which will maintain the bases of the theory of utilitarianism, the happiness of the individual. The internal contradiction is especially prominent in all that concerns the contexts of the individual and the state from a utilitarian point of view, that is, where state intervention does not harm liberty. Here it is possible that it was appropriate to address in a less biased manner the solution of comprehensive social help to the fellow man, where he himself recognizes the absence of injury to liberty. In coming to try and refute my claim according to which Mill's analysis at this point leaves in an unsatisfactory way the issue of the institutional solution of the problem of social gaps, I will seek first to argue that Mill seeks to contend in a comprehensive manner with this issue, both regarding the present and regarding the development of society in the future, while expanding the activity of civil society beyond the rules of its operation in the private market, while rendering unnecessary the need to address solutions in this matter from within the institutions of the state, such as the one proposed here, from which he sought to distance himself as much as possible. This expansion is proposed by him both from the aspect of profit motives, which has in it an additional incentive for the citizen taking upon himself this activity, and additionally, in a voluntary manner according to principles of helping others, which will be nurtured in society. In this, there is a compatibility with his claim that state intervention in these cases is necessary in a narrow way, that is, only in a general and channeling manner of the organizations of civil society. Mill seeks to direct that the state shall take a role in this matter which will not have the effect of intensifying its power, and especially its bureaucratic power, but rather it will be a role of guidance, collection of information, which will have the effect of influencing the decision-making of the individuals engaged in the fields, and a role of supervision, so that the goals of helping others, both in a voluntary manner and in a business manner, shall be maintained properly. As such, it seems that in Mill's general solution concerning the general utilitarian meaning of helping others in the present, there is no place for the strengthening of the state through the establishment of an institution like the fourth authority, but specifically through addressing the possibilities standing in this field within the framework of civil society. In this weave encompassing the entirety of social activity of helping others, it seems that there is no place at all for a fourth authority as an additional authority over the other three, but at most for a social body of a supervising, collecting, direction outlining character, like those already found in the executive authority, government ministries in the field, and the legislative, parliamentary committees, and which perhaps, if at all, there is room to improve them, to streamline their activity. Alongside the utilitarian principles requiring the citizen to act for his personal existence, the actual social task upon the citizens, both in a voluntary manner and in a business manner, while having active directed but not directly intervening activity, possesses the capacity to constitute a comprehensive middle way matching the way of utilitarianism, namely, a weave of productive relations between citizen and citizen which takes into account both interests and value aspects toward the community, as well as the prevention of a severe corruption which will harm both the goal and society in the image of an ever-swelling bureaucratic weave that feeds mainly itself according to the corrupting nature of government. I believe that according to the basic assumptions of this work, there is an inherent problem in Mill's approach as it is. In generalization, it can be argued that these are arguments some of which are seemingly irrefutable, and hence their scientific nullity. Thus, for example, even if the state were in the nature of a quasi-objective body, acting according to a sublime principle of the public good, even then it would not, according to Mill's solution, provide an answer to the problem of social gaps in that same field, where a contemporary injury to liberty by the state does not exist. The compromise which Mill seeks to offer us, namely of a supervising, directing, information conveying, protecting, and recommending intervention, cannot stand by itself before the massive concentrated forces of civil society unless actual power is added to it. The balance point must be different, that is, one that includes his proposal, but at the same time allows for the initiation of significant processes to implement it. Firstly, you cannot draw a parallel between that invisible hand, between that market mechanism which is efficient for the subject of commodity prices and the improvement of service to customers, and between the need for the existence of minimum conditions for existence with dignity, for the reduction of gaps in society, and the increase of equality of opportunity. These are matters which the profit considerations of individuals cannot direct alone, since they are opposed to them by definition. That same self-interest according to which the actors operate at the base of the liberal market can dwell together with the need to help others in a completely unintentional way, as long as it does not substantively harm that same interest, which is what drives them in their economic activity. As long as it has the capacity to preserve social stability that allows for their profits, then communal activity will be welcome, but not beyond a certain limit, when it is required to divide the social cake in a more proportional manner, in a way in which both a competitive economy and freer initiative will exist together, alongside proper minimum conditions for the majority of the population, which will allow for that same increase of competition regarding them too, as well as the development of diverse ideas, views, thoughts, and lifestyles, among others in the economic field. Hence, there is no escape from a combination between the activity of civil society and a hand that is directing, intervening in a gradual manner, and subject to the principles of liberty, an open hand declaring, "This society acts and is responsible for all its individuals, for their happiness, for their welfare, for their existence with dignity, as well as for their personal and economic liberty," albeit in an enlightened manner tending toward advice, guidance, recommendation, and indirect intervention, but for corrective purposes acts through legitimate ways of power as equal in status to the other authorities for the purpose of balancing the anti-liberty aspects of civil society, with its narrow government that is influenced and weak toward the owners of wealth and strong against the majority of the public, which is weak in itself. You cannot require a corrective solution such as voluntary activity alone on top of that mechanism of the free market and the supervising state which sheds every possible social responsibility in the name of the goddess of privatization, to overcome in a systemic manner the problem of social gaps. The common denominator for voluntary and profitable activities in this context will be integrated state supervision, of the type accepted in utilitarian theories, and the activity of the owners of wealth, who are those who will constitute the main ones standing behind these enterprises by the nature of things. But to these will be added a significant communal power of those citizens whose formal and substantive liberty is in their hand, and they have not only the possibility to be added to the circle of competition, but also to communal doing. This power will be accompanied by intervening activity in these fields, indirect for economic affairs and direct for social affairs, which is part of the state mechanism, but separate from pure utilitarian interests of the existing authority, which will serve as an actual mouth and hand for the majority of the population that stands today abandoned to the mercy of the barons of civil society. The weak public, even that which earns a living, has today neither the time nor the ability to dedicate to these matters, let alone in a way where a real general influence is made possible, except for exceptional cases and without at all making light of their contribution individually. Within this, I include both those toiling at the low and middle levels, both the elderly population and the unemployed population. As for the volunteers, they can be harnessed during their leisure hours if they work, unless these are those who have retired or are in their teens. Either way, it is clear that in a general way, these are not those in need in themselves for help for themselves, so that they can act in a real way for their home, who according to the assumptions of this work constitute the majority of society. Let alone it is reasonable that they will not be the ones standing behind these actions, except for exceptions, simply because their situation, including the socio-economic one, does not allow them to establish and manage general systems of this type. And I do not address now the personal implications of citizen versus citizen in this solution. Even if the owners of wealth are the ones standing behind these activities, then in a structured way, this activity of theirs will not contradict their economic activity and will not have the effect of establishing against them a civil social array that could one day compete with them or bite into their cake because of its needs, in a share that would have a real social influence, as distinguished from the unsanctified millions presented for show as their contribution to society, not to speak of those voluntary bodies managed by the owners of money under the assumption that they do not receive a salary for this activity. But beyond this, also regarding the supervising state, the fundamental claim in this work is that the decisive influence of the owners of wealth, as well as the extreme individualistic values which have spread everywhere, including and especially within the corridors of government in the democratic liberal state, contributes specifically to the increase of social gaps, let alone that it has no capacity to reduce them. Not only this, but the state itself, which is increasingly shedding those classic social areas of responsibility, is in a constant process of both economic and social privatization that gradually crumbles its existing social institutions, as can be seen mainly during situations of mass crisis such as the hurricane disaster in New Orleans, the Second Lebanon War, the disengagement, etc., regarding the treatment of the Western capitalist state with its mechanisms of the population in need of help. It will not be surprising if this process eventually percolates toward its liberal institutions, which are also founded on public trust and a minimum of social solidarity, such as the judicial system, the army, etc. It emerges, therefore, that both the civil activity in itself and the supervising activity, according to the basic assumptions of this work, are carried out under the decisive influence of the owners of wealth, who seek to preserve the social situation as it is, and even to increase for their own benefit the rate of gaps, provided it does not cause instability that would endanger their status and their profits. Voluntary actions, which by all accounts possess great moral value in themselves, serve the paramount interest of the owners of wealth, which is stability, for the sake of the continuation and intensification of their status, insofar as these are well photographed activities. but they do not substantively affect the entirety or the majority of the population, including its entry into the circles of competition. You cannot demand extreme individual liberty without state intervention regarding the field of livelihood and the individual's minimal entry conditions into competition and communal activity, and simultaneously argue that the gaps created due to this system will be solved by the leisure hours of those who have, without a fundamentally different intervention of society as a whole. All those private social activities, without having a comprehensive and significant leverage, will naturally concentrate in a limited way on specific issues, while the state, which sheds more and more of its social obligations, will leave the affairs of the sheep in the hands of the wolves. The free market, required for the sake of optimum prices and the utility of business services to citizens, as well as minimum government intervention and maximum liberty for the individual, may lower the cost prices in treating the ever-increasing weak populations, as well as the ever-weakening middle class, both for the state mechanism and for the owners of wealth required for these matters. But it will not solve their comprehensive problem at all, as it cannot be fundamentally subject to the principle of the invisible hand, since the lives of citizens requiring compassion, understanding, and investment, which usually has no material profit alongside it and is outside of profit considerations, are not parallel to the quality of products.
Mill and the personal utilitarian civil meaning of helping others.
Without harming all that has been claimed regarding the general aspect of the civil activity proposed by Mill, it is appropriate to address his claims regarding its specific communal meaning, namely toward those performing those activities for helping others versus the benefit of those for whom they are performed. As stated, as distinguished from the typical analysis of society and individual relations regarding purely business matters, here Mill adds the voluntary aspect to the business aspect, which together create a complete picture in his view for the roles of helping others through civil society, such as, for example, a program for the rehabilitation of prisoners, or private bureaus for finding or training for work, or private schools, etc. Mill's opposition to state actions in this field, which does not harm liberty, is argued with more emphasis from the personal utilitarian aspect of those acting within civil society to help others, and hence also toward this aspect in a general social way. By this, Mill seeks to continue and distance himself from a utilitarian point of view from institutional solutions within the framework of the state for the problem of social gaps, let alone of the type of the fourth authority proposed here. The individual seeking profit will, in his view, better be of help to his fellow than the state, and this mainly for the motive driving him, that is, the profit that creates efficiency in work, strict requirements for professional and focused work with the sword of dismissal alongside them, while preserving workers' rights, as well as the unmediated and non-dogmatic connection of private enterprises with the population compared to public enterprises. Actions within frameworks such as that of the state may, as has been proven in the past, be devoid of efficiency, tending toward red tape and missing their goal, as the power standing behind their performers is immeasurably greater than the power of private bodies, and in parallel may influence an improper treatment toward the public of customers. There is a preference that the state should engage against a private factor as a mediator also in social matters in which perhaps it should be given more extensive, more significant supervision than in purely business matters, rather than it engaging in a direct manner against the citizen in these matters. This separation of powers between the citizen and the state will only benefit him as he could always turn with a complaint toward it above those acting for his affairs, whereas when the state acts in a direct manner for his affairs, all that will be in his hand to do, as far as it concerns legal activity, and also in a significant part of the exceptions, will perhaps be to turn to the mercies of heaven. Conversely, those who argue will argue that, as distinguished from the commitment of the profitable enterprise to its public of customers, which creates relations of competition and enrichment for the benefit of the customers, the business acting for welfare purposes toward one who has not, is not directly committed in terms of its profit needs to the public in which it treats, and at any rate, it is driven and therefore limited by profit considerations, as distinguished from considerations of budgetary balance to which any public institution can be committed. Therefore, out of an assumption that profit considerations are what drive it first and foremost, a failure may certainly be created at the level of the interests themselves between efficiency in achieving profit and the quality of the treatment of the population subject to the action of that same institution. Beyond this, it is appropriate to argue that if the treatment of the problem of social gaps is given into the hands of private institutions acting out of a neoliberal worldview, then the best treaters or professionals will choose in the private market to work specifically in those places where their personal welfare will be the highest. These private places will not likely be those same places whose customers are of poor means. The situation is different when society sees as its goal within the framework of the state to act for the reduction of social gaps. The aura surrounding the state's actions for the public mission, found in it as well as proper budgeting for proper wages, may specifically attract the best in that same field, which is not the bureaucratic field, but the field of the action itself. I myself believe that there is nothing in these arguments to contradict the need for the establishment of the fourth authority. This authority must also implement some of Mill's reservations and ideas in the context of state activity as a mediating factor, but this time possessing more extensive and more significant powers than those existing today within the framework of the executive authority, which seeks to shed every dimension of intervention. These powers will receive legislative backing from within the executive authority, as well as suitable parallel and restraining criticism. Indeed, the nature of market needs is not like the nature of the needs of helping others, welfare. As such, there is place to establish a state body of significant weight, of a true social orientation anchored in its foundations, which will have significant and teeth-bearing supervision and control possibilities toward local, business, and voluntary welfare authorities. The establishment of a body of this type will not render the activity of civil society unnecessary at all, but it will constitute a proper instance for supervision, for removing failures, for promoting welfare affairs, for information and suitable guidelines, suitable theories, required budgets, out of a supreme view seeing the entirety of social welfare needs. The existing situation in which the executive authority is the one engaging in welfare affairs, out of a utilitarian and bureaucratic view without real supervision and control, while centralizing power simultaneously with shedding the social roles of the state, and first and foremost without a plan, way, and real ability for true and significant relief of the distress of the majority of the population, as well as for the reduction of gaps in society, cannot and must not continue. Here it is appropriate to add a few words regarding the voluntary activity, which is seemingly the complementary aspect of civil activity. Here too, I tend to agree with Mill that this activity will benefit those performing it, and that there is importance in it for the communal development of the citizen. Cultivating commitment to the community, voluntary activities for helping the elderly, the sick, those with educational difficulties, the luckless, all these are indeed very much blessed. But just as regarding the profit-bearing social activities, toward which more extensive supervision must be given, due to the dimension of profit or financial utility to their managers, which is liable to come at the expense of their goals, can it really be expected that these activities will be of real help to those populations, let alone in a systemic aspect? Voluntary activities in themselves cannot be truly professional because they are performed by one whose main occupation is in other matters. Furthermore, they are performed during the leisure hours of those engaged in them, and in most cases, they are an additional side occupation that is not at the top of their minds like their family's livelihood, and they cannot be performed with the full power dedicated to personal matters by the nature of things. The desire for the existence of useful and communal citizens is a blessed desire which must be nurtured in every society. But with all due respect, the main goal of this activity must be that same real help in solving the problem of social gaps, of which one of the effects is the good citizenship of the helpers. Without doubt, there is in activity of this type no comprehensive and true solution to the issues of social gaps, but at most, help that is in the systemic aspect usually marginal. Mill's solution seems, in my eyes, without needing proofs in the field of reality, as a perfunctory fulfillment of duty from that same real problem encompassing his theory from its beginning, which I would express in an analogy to the language of one of his conceptual rivals. Man was born free, and everywhere he is free in disguise and is not happy. How this change occurred, I do not know. And what can change it? This question, it seems to me, I can solve.
Mill, the intervening state, and the general long-term utilitarian meaning.
The main attack from Mill's point of view on the idea of the fourth authority originates in the third argument for preventing state intervention in helping the individual where there is no injury to his liberty, namely, regarding the danger in the expansion of the state through its bureaucratic mechanism. This danger is based primarily on two factors: on the ever-increasing needs, including the needs of the citizens' dependency on the state, and for reasons of the natural development of institutions, which tend to increase their power and sometimes simultaneously also their opacity, and eventually their disconnection from their original goals. Here it can be argued that this argument is also valid for the establishment of the fourth authority. True, from the outset, this is an institution acting within a framework of checks and balances, this being as distinguished from the state as a single entity with a single orientation, as in Mill's analysis. But that same dependency of the citizens, that same will for power and expansion existing in every institution, as history proves, especially when principles of social justice stand at the base of its original action. That same sense of mission, as well as the will for power, are liable to cause its expansion at the expense of the other, less popular authorities, and in certain historical circumstances, even to overshadow them with the increase of the power and strength of the institution, answering needs which are, as stated, inexhaustible and ever-increasing, while intervening in social and even economic fields and harming the basic principles of liberty. According to this view, the natural and clearest checks and balances already existing are sufficient, namely, the ideological and personal liberty found in the legislative house elected directly by the people, and there is no need to tip the scales in a way that may turn out to be destructive and dangerous to the citizen's liberty as it develops. I cannot accept this argument. Firstly, it is proper to remember that the mechanism of civil society as well, during the seemingly minimal intervention of the state, except for the matter of its preservation, is a social institution from which the danger of spread and overpower does not escape. Since we are dealing with a situation where individual liberty is not harmed in the present, the expectation for the development of state institutions is a hypothesis that is reasonable, just as the development of civil society institutions without proper balance toward a severe injury to the rights and liberties of the individual is reasonable and, in my opinion, even proven. The shedding of responsibility from the state, that is, from society in a comprehensive or nearly comprehensive manner, in matters of those who do not possess liberty because they lack the basic material minimum conditions necessary for a person to maintain self-autonomy, namely, a life of dignity and participation in the community, is liable conceptually to lead from the opposite side to exactly that same claim of Mill's. That is to say, to a massive shutdown of liberty for the majority of individuals, to a different kind of slavery, to bureaucracy and the decisive influence of the owners of wealth who seek to increase their profits more and more in the name of the principle of liberty on the backs of others, for whom the opportunities for competition are closing before them, with the increase of the power and influence of the owners of wealth. This issue receives double validity in an era of advanced technology, as distinguished from Mill's time, when for the needs of the developing industry, there was a necessity for working hands and for the working class as well as the middle class, and therefore they had a great and structured weight which could receive distinct expression and cause change within the framework of struggles in the legislative houses. As technology continues to develop, there is naturally less and less need for working hands, not to mention the intra-systemic problem raised by the issue of globalization from the aspects of employment and unemployment. The influence, especially in an era of mass media, is expanding with the economic takeover of the owners of wealth over all those vital areas of life which in the past were held by the state, as well as over the media outlets and over the immediate and general accessibility, for example, cinema, to the entire population. The solitary, weak, exploited person, his power is dwindling, his liberty is narrowing, although the illusions he buys in his distress fill his life more and more. More movies, more cable, more gambling under the auspices of the state and others, more donations. According to the basic assumptions of this work, social gaps are expanding, and so is the distress of the lower and middle classes. This matter, especially in an era where Mill's original theory is the one ruling, has the capacity to show that his argument is problematic and in practice refuted. The way of the fourth authority may therefore be that same middle way which allows both to influence and to be influenced at the same time, and yet not leave the interest of the economically weak individual, who constitutes the vast majority of the population, to his illusions and the rule of the barons of civil society. It is proper to remember that the beginning of the princes, kings, and counts was also in family ownership of lands and money, in an era of knights who protected, together with the church, the residents. So too is the beginning of the rule of the owners of money, in the desire for the liberty of the citizens, and its end in a different type of subjugation. As distinguished from Marx's proposals or from the welfare state mechanism, the fourth authority seeks to adopt principles which have been proven to match the spirit of the free man, both from the aspects of political liberty and from the aspects of substantive democracy and material equality. From this aspect of location between liberty and equality in terms of state intervention, Mill's analysis is perceived in my eyes both theoretically and practically, according to the basic assumptions of this work, as an extreme argument that does not stand, although many of his arguments must certainly be taken into account during the practical implementation of the fourth authority. This authority is seen in my eyes as a middle solution, seeking to give an answer also to all those questions expressed by Mill regarding the internal contradiction of the theory of utilitarianism in all that concerns the issue of social gaps. Questions that did not find, in my view, a sufficient institutional solution in this analysis of Mill.
3. Due to the lack of an institutional conclusion to the problem of the supremacy of the first principle of justice over the second in Rawls's theory of justice, in the context of solving the problem of social gaps.
Utilitarianism, which, in its moderate development, offered a combined solution to the issue of gaps within the framework of civil society, and in its extreme way abandoned the individual to his bitter fate in the name of the pursuit of private happiness, did not bring the longed-for change. Instead, it even served, unintentionally, as a ground for a dramatic continuation of the enrichment of the few and the widening of gaps in society. Now the time has come to return, albeit cautiously, to the state and its institutions. It is no wonder that the leading idea in this field in the 20th century was a kind of return from matters of subjective empirical need toward matters of objective right, to the framework of the social contract, which essentially tried to integrate the two, the need to preserve the right to life, liberty, and property. If I can argue that Locke was the harbinger of Rousseau's first social contract, then I would say of Rawls that he is the harbinger of the second contract regarding his theory of justice, which emerged to global consciousness in 1971. The protection of individual rights claimed in Locke's conceptual state of nature is indeed handed over to a society operating through three branches. However, the discussion regarding the question of inequality and social justice in that primordial society mentioned in the second treatise does not receive a solution, and not without reason. As I noted above, Locke was engaged, by the nature of his times, in a primary solution against absolutism and governmental arbitrariness toward a parliamentary democracy monarchy. Therefore, Rawls's simple and brilliant idea regarding an additional conceptual state of nature, in which the awareness of the rational individual is hidden from interest, status, view of the good, psychological outlook, resources, and self and natural abilities behind a veil of ignorance, for the purpose of finding the laws of social justice in a state of fairness between individuals and in a consensual, impartial manner, provides a primary and principled answer to this lack, while preserving the rules derived from Locke's classical state of nature. From this hypothetical research position, two principles of justice are derived. The first concerns liberty. Each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive basic liberty compatible with a similar liberty for others. The second concerns equality. Social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both A, reasonably expected to be to everyone's advantage, and B, attached to positions and offices open to all. In other words, it must be organized so that it works to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged in society. According to Rawls, the first principle is supreme and prior to the second. Liberty should be limited only for the sake of liberty itself, and it is superior to any other social good. To achieve distributive justice and establish the desired socio-economic process, there is a need for a suitable institutional, political, and legal environment, which is essentially a derivative of the first principle and is embodied in the constitutional regime of a well-organized democratic society, meaning freedom of thought, fair political liberty, and a fair procedural process. The second principle of justice is realized after the establishment of the basic constitutional framework, through laws adapted to the socio-economic factual reality, by four background institutions of justice that integrate with the action and essence of the primary institutions. In this chapter, I will argue that the fourth authority integrates well against the central, conceptual, practical problem of Rawls's theory, which he himself does not solve, under the assumption that the original position and his two principles of justice are not in dispute. As for the conceptual problem, it is embodied in Rawls's claim that the first principle is supreme and prior to the second. This claim, the source of which may be the difficulty Rawls felt, like some of the original philosophers, to detach from the utilitarian and classical liberal sources against which he actually emerged, has proven to be mistaken if only for the simple reason that without property and its protection, there is no liberty. In practice, Rawls himself contradicted this claim from the outset, and finally disavowed it almost completely, following the criticism leveled against it in Hart's article. The fourth authority conceptually embodies the continuation of Locke's idea regarding the need for protection of the natural right to life, liberty, and property in an equal manner, and the implementation of the two principles of justice in an equal status, devoid of supremacy and preferences. Therefore, instead of background institutions that lack the ability for real influence beyond their conceptual placement, the establishment of the fourth authority as an independent branch is more natural, embodying directly the second principle of justice as a check and balance against the three classical branches. Rawls himself states in his book that the central problem of justice as fairness is embodied in its distributive aspect, namely, in the application of the second principle, and he too is aware that his solution is not clear and perhaps requires another solution. Analysis of Mills. My claim in this chapter will therefore be that the principles of justice do not possess a different order of priorities, that liberty should dwell together and in an equal manner with equality. Therefore, there is no place for governmental background institutions, but rather for a change of the existing institutions by adding the fourth authority. This authority will engage, among other things, in the implementation of the second principle of justice proposed by Rawls, as well as in the struggle over the distribution of surpluses which Rawls attributes to an additional background branch that is not, in his opinion, a direct derivative of the second principle. In other words, the process during which the two principles of justice will be integrated in an applied manner will not be between primary institutions and background institutions, but between the primary institutions themselves, including the fourth authority.
General priority aspects of social justice.
The opposition to establishing the fourth authority as equal in status to the other three authorities is embedded in the priority principle between Rawls's two principles of justice, as the derivative from it is necessarily a difference in status between the institutions derived from the first principle and those derived from the second. Rawls seeks to justify the division of the two principles of justice derived from the veil of ignorance in their orders of priority within accepted approaches regarding the essence and role of institutional social justice principles. The accepted perception, in his view, allows for one supreme principle or several principles that must be ranked in one or another order of priority, which guide the action of institutions in society. According to the first possibility, such as that found in the theory of utilitarianism, one must suffice with one supreme principle from which all social institutions founded on aspects of social morality are derived. One of the central justifications for this is that several principles might clash with each other and not allow for the drawing of clear institutional conclusions. The difficulties that the recourse to one supreme principle might raise, as they were revealed in his view in the theory of utilitarianism, for example, lead to the second possibility, which is the recourse to several supreme principles. This matter is also explained by the need, from justice aspects, to address not only rational rules, but also intuitive rules, albeit in a reduced manner as far as possible. Hence arises Rawls's desire to act against the principle of utilitarianism and establish a theory that gives consideration to both aspects of liberty and the need for material equality, but in a gradual manner so that that necessary clash between these two opposing principles does not occur and cause the adoption of extreme social theories from this direction or another. The practical meaning of this approach is that there is no place for an independent social authority equal in status to the other authorities, but rather for background institutions built on top of the existing institutions as detailed above. To this reference of Rawls, it is appropriate to respond in two ways. Firstly, he too agrees that these are not the two exclusive possibilities in outlining institutional principles of social justice, and the things are also revealed from the logic itself. Even if you believe that one and only one principle is incorrect and impossible in a human society that is complex by its nature, both in its rational aspects and even more so its intuitive ones regarding general and cross-cutting justice, such as that placed at the foundations of the most vital social institutions, this does not necessitate, conceptually at least, the acceptance of two or more principles in a gradual order, let alone if this ranking is lexical. Secondly, the solution to the problem of the clash between two principles cannot be a gradual solution, especially if there is at least the agreement that these are primary principles of the highest order. The explanation that the ranking will be lexical is certainly not convincing, because the ranking may assume actual supremacy, and supremacy means, in a reasonable manner, an erosion that assumes deprivation to the point of the practical abolition of the principle that is in a lower priority. But more than that, the problematicalness in Rawls's proposal revealed on its face is not placed only in the very solution he seeks to propose to us, but especially in the reasons which led him to this solution, which appear problematic from a rational logical perspective and hence are not necessarily acceptable to those behind the veil of ignorance. It seems to me that Rawls was caught here in a problem which he left for a solution in other times while emphasizing its severity. Firstly, if there are two possibilities for the people behind the veil of ignorance, namely, to choose one supreme principle or two or more for the purpose of a decision regarding the suitable social structure from a point of view of social justice, and if there is no rational solution for choosing two principles, then it can be argued that this claim of the possibility for the action of two principles is impossible, and hence that indeed the principle of utilitarianism is the principle that must be implemented from a rational perspective. A different possibility is to reach a more general principle of justice. But if Rawls seeks to convince the Western world that a single supreme principle is not a suitable derivative of the veil of ignorance state, he should have examined in greater detail and with greater deliberation the possibility of the two principles dwelling together. It is not possible to suffice with the claim that the principles will be implemented in a lexical order because there is no other choice. This claim, which is saturated with intuitiveness, is not suitable for the objective aspect of the veil of ignorance, and creates a severe matter to the point that it could, in my view, collapse Rawls's entire proposed theory. This problem is revealed in its full severity in Rawls's practical analysis regarding those institutions that maintain the second principle. We are dealing with an obscure analysis which proposes background institutions that are not at all clear how they will be implemented, especially in a reality where the first principle creates social gaps and subconditions of equality of opportunity, which, according to the basic assumptions in this work, do not allow, conceptually and practically alike, the outlining of these obscure and unclear principles. The fact that traditional moral theories are mostly based on one of the two aforementioned possibilities does not constitute a real moral justification for continued adherence to ways that have so far not yielded the desired results, according to Rawls, for outlining institutions whose basis is in social justice and whose goal is the reduction of gaps in society. A solution embodying within it the fear of a clash between the principles and channeling it into a productive competition, into a combination of free will and the absence of extremism from the direction of one principle at the expense of the other, seems like a worthy possibility, at least for discussion, and not for basic ignorance of this type. This solution is embodied in the proposal I am addressing in this work. Nevertheless, at this stage, it is proper to address the specific reasons why Rawls seeks to convince us to agree to his priority solution, while in the final hypothesis, I will address a positive possibility derived from this analysis, namely, how the solution of the fourth authority integrates with the suitable solution from an aspect of social justice for the establishment of social institutions.
Specific priority aspects and the detachment from the state of nature, the original position.
The specific reasons for the priority of the liberty principle are explained by Rawls through the approach of people in the original position behind the veil of ignorance, regarding the long term of the general conception of pursuing justice under preferred reasonable conditions. In his view, when the conditions of civilization improve, the intrinsic importance of our socio-economic progress will be low relative to the interests of liberty, which become more important and stronger as conditions for the execution of equal liberties of which we are fully aware. At this point in time, from the perspective of the original position, agreeing to less liberty in exchange for material benefits and benefits of social status becomes irrational. As the general standard of living rises, the less urgent, less basic material needs are those remaining to be advanced, at least regarding social institutions and forms. At the same time, the obstacles to the realization of equal liberty decrease, and the desire to achieve spiritual and social interests rises. Therefore, it becomes more important to ensure the freedom of the inner lives of communities in terms of unity within the framework of equal liberty. Under preferred circumstances, when the basic conditions are ensured, the basic interest in planning our lives will necessitate a preference between the principles. The need for freedom of thought and conscience and the central place held by self-respect and the aspiration of man to express his nature in a free social reality with others cause liberty to be the supreme regulative interest that one must assume man in the original position would choose for his social future. It seems to me that Rawls errs in this analysis not only from the aspects suggested by Hart, namely, regarding the inability to observe from the state of nature what the preferred principle will be beyond the veil of ignorance in an unknown developmental future. In my view, the error also stems from it being in itself an impossible deviation from the foundations of Rawls's own theory. The conceptual state of nature of Locke, Rousseau, and Rawls, who by his own words is their successor, assumes that man, in establishing a social institution, seeks to protect his property, his life, his liberty, and his basic private property within a state of equality of opportunity existing in the state of nature. To these basic assumptions, Rawls added, for the purpose of choosing the principles of justice at the base of establishing that same social institution, the conscious ignorance of those people in the state of nature or original position regarding their psychological, conceptual, general, and personal tendencies. For preferences from the starting point do not allow, by definition, the determination of broad principles of justice acceptable to the collective. Rawls himself also agrees, albeit quite inconspicuously, that the matter of priority is suitable for a certain stage in the progress of civilization where man's basic conditions are satisfied, and it is not rational for him to give up his liberty, which is his central human need after the existence of those basic conditions, in exchange for progress beyond those conditions, while that same liberty will allow him to progress both privately and generally in these aspects as well. In this, Rawls deviates from the base of his own theory. Those human beings in the original position behind the veil of ignorance must be required to establish social institutions for the sake of protecting their basic property, and not toward their future state which they cannot predict, even as an assumption by the very fact of their being in a state of veil of ignorance. A different approach would actually hollow out the idea of the veil of ignorance, as it allows the people of the veil of ignorance to assume future states different from their own state, which they do not know, as remembered. Even if we assume they do not know their own state precisely, there is no rational way in this to detach so drastically and unjustifiably from that same basic reason for establishing those social institutions. The addition of the search for the basic social justice conditions that are supposed to be at the base of those institutions must remain within the framework of that same basic state Rawls assumes, namely, the state of nature from the school of Locke and Rousseau, a state of protection of basic conditions in a state of ignorance.
Rawls's assumption that the material basic conditions in the future are such that there is no need to address their protection, and hence the search for surplus material conditions is not equal in value to the interest of liberty, does not stand, with all due respect, at the foundations of his own theory. In exactly the same way and in parallel, one could argue that the people behind the veil of ignorance should assume the existence of basic liberty conditions in a future society and the non-existence of material basic conditions. This assumption would place specifically the second principle in priority against the first principle. The original position, or state of nature, necessitates by definition protection of life, liberty, and property in a parallel and mutually nourishing manner, one of the need of the other. Without life, there is no need for liberty. Without property, there is no liberty. Without liberty, there is no worthy life, etc. Therefore, this argument of Rawls's for the need for priority between the principles falls, and there remains the need claimed in the research hypothesis for the establishment of a social institution, which will answer in an equal status to those principles derived from the state of nature. Both the principle of liberty and the principle of distributive justice together. Just as man is not interested in giving up his liberty, so he is not interested in giving up his property which allows his liberty, his private happiness, and his communal happiness alike.
Practical aspects of the search for an institution founded on social justice. The pure procedural process. Between the primary institutions themselves, including the fourth authority, as distinguished from a process between primary institutions and background institutions, without the fourth authority.
The final and summarizing issue to which I seek to address in the analysis of this research hypothesis is the practicality of implementing the two principles of justice in a parallel manner. In other words, that an implementation of this type means a pure procedural process, in an ideal way, between the primary institutions themselves, including the fourth authority, as distinguished from the process proposed by Rawls between the primary institutions without the fourth authority, and the background institutions. Rawls repeats time after time the determination that the implementation of distributive justice within the framework of social institutions in society is the central and even the most difficult task of the justice as fairness enterprise. This understandable determination repeats itself so many times that it seems to have a kind of apologetic sound in it, since, in my view, the treatment of it leaves it, in Rawls, in a fog, if not more than that. Admittedly, as he himself notes, his theory is a theory of justice and not an economic theory. But he sees fit, of course, to try and show how the two principles of justice, and especially the second principle, which is of course more problematic from an implementation aspect in the liberal democratic society, which is the subject of this work, could be implemented both in the liberal democratic society, in the society he calls liberal socialist, and possibly even in the socialist society. However, when we compare the derivative to the foundations of his theory, namely, the decisions of human beings behind the veil of ignorance in determining the two principles of justice, which themselves I accept for the purposes of this work as they are, though not the relationship between them, it appears that he stands before a fundamental contradiction revealed on its face between the principled aspect of the implementation of the second principle of his theory, and in my opinion, also the first in senses touching each other between the two principles, and his proposal for their implementation. The solution to this inherent problem in Rawls's proposal is found, in my view, in his own theory, through the questions he raises and solves in a primary but mistaken way. First and foremost, as an assumption, I accept that from the state of nature, two principles of justice are derived, one concerning equal liberty for all, and the second concerning substantive socio-economic equality. I have already shown that it is not possible from a rational perspective, out of the decision of the veil of ignorance, to decide which principle shall be superior to the other, not from the aspect of time, not from the aspect of place, and not from a theoretical aspect. Therefore, it is appropriate to assume in a theoretical way that these principles must be implemented from the veil of ignorance as equal in status.
Since the people of the veil of ignorance are incapable of deciding how these principles will be implemented in practice, as they must be decided between in different situations under different conditions, out of an assumption that there are points in them that may be contradictory. And since, as distinguished from their inability to decide in practice, they do have the possibility to decide regarding the suitable procedural process for the implementation of these principles, out of principles of justice, then the answer to the problem presented is not lexical arbitrary, but procedural substantive. This decision is required for the establishment of institutions which in themselves contain no decision, but rather set in motion a process of decision, namely, a suitable procedural process. Indeed, Rawls notes quite rightly that the state of ignorance generates a procedural principle regarding the implementation of the second principle, which is the principle of the pure procedural justice process. But this principle does not stand even in approximation to his practical proposal, which is, as remembered, the main goal of his theory as well as of social justice as it is, according to Rawls himself. The wonder regarding Rawls's practical proposal increases as Rawls continues with the practical analysis, which is not profound by his own standards, regarding the implementation of the second principle. What he sees fit to propose after the analysis of the suitable interpretive principle for the second principle of justice are four background branches which will supposedly act upon the existing institutions, which were established according to the first principle, without clarifying how, even in a general way, a compatibility exists between this proposal and the pure procedural justice process. Furthermore, the problematic division between the two basic principles is evident here. How is equality of opportunity possible without a socio-economic minimum? And what is that required minimum for the purpose of maintaining equal political liberty, if not the matter of the distribution of income, wealth, etc.? Fields that obviously touch upon one another between the first and second principles, both in the conceptual aspect and in the most important aspect in his view, namely, the establishment of suitable social institutions for the realization of this matter. Furthermore, only after the exhaustion of the principles of justice, if the person chooses to address expenditures that are not subject to this process, which are voluntary, only then will he be required to build a new representative body whose basis is not the principles of justice, but another principle in the name of the exchange principle. This body, which is supposed to receive its decisions unanimously, or nearly unanimously, is required for the sake of a decision on the allocation of the public's resources, after the principles of justice have reached an exhaustive implementation, and all this when the public seeks to make expenditures which are not derivatives of the principles of justice, but from an excess choice of a will for additional goods.
It is evident that Rawls seeks to establish an institution that would theoretically allow for action not in accordance with the principles of justice once these are exhausted, but in such a way that would not cause a reverse process undermining the good state reached by society upon the exhaustion of these principles. Namely, that the representatives of the people would require an absolute majority, if not unanimous agreement, in their matter. A thing which is perceived as virtually impossible anyway. It is unclear why Rawls seeks to dedicate a specific institution specifically to this branch, compared to the generality and vagueness regarding the institutions required for the implementation of the second principle, which is undoubtedly the most difficult and important task as he himself defines it. Furthermore, it is not clear why one cannot simply declare that a decision of this type be given to the existing legislative body, which would be required to address it after consultation with certain bodies, and by a special majority as determined, etc. Beyond this, it is not clear why to dedicate or allow a deviation from the operation of the principles of justice at all. For the assumption is that in a free and democratic society, there will always be certain class differences, if only due to differences in talents, abilities, and motivations, as distinguished from differences in opportunity, etc. Therefore, there will always be a need for the operation of the principles of justice, to reduce gaps as much as possible, and allow for minimum conditions and fair equal opportunity. And thus it is not clear why to dedicate a branch or institution at all to a possibility that is perceived as merely theoretical anyway.
It is unclear why Rawls seeks to dedicate a specific institution specifically to this branch, compared to the generality and vagueness regarding the institutions required for the implementation of the second principle, which is undoubtedly the most difficult and important task, as he himself defines it. Furthermore, it is not clear why one cannot simply declare that a decision of this type be given to the existing legislative body, which would be required to address it after consultation with certain bodies, and by a special majority as determined, etc. Beyond this, it is not clear why to dedicate or allow a deviation from the operation of the principles of justice at all. For the assumption is that in a free and democratic society, there will always be certain class differences, if only due to differences in talents, abilities, and motivations, as distinguished from differences in opportunity, etc. Therefore, there will always be a need for the operation of the principles of justice, to reduce gaps as much as possible, and allow for minimum conditions and fair equal opportunity. And thus, it is not clear why to dedicate a branch or institution at all to a possibility that is perceived as merely theoretical anyway. It seems to me that after the truly brilliant analysis of the principles of justice regarding the applied chapter, Rawls actually invites a correction and completion of his theory, and he does so in a way that, in my view, appears unambiguous due to the contradictions and wonders it evokes. Following his repeated declarations that this is in fact the most important chapter, the applied chapter, to which he dedicates a small number of words, seemingly for the sake of a perfunctory fulfillment of duty, or toward a more profound argument, a call for the continuation of the proposed trend of correcting the structure of Western society.
His general and vague solutions to the most important problem of his theory, namely, the institutional realization of the principle of distributive justice, invite a solution that would be on its face possible, clear, and closer to the framework of a pure procedural process, such that the decision regarding the manner of implementing the second principle of justice upon the primary institutions, let alone in parallel to the institutions derived from the first principle, will not be carried out in its particular sense by the people of the veil of ignorance, in the sense that they would have to decide which principle would prevail during a contradiction between them, or what the actual particular meaning of the components of the second principle is. Instead, an independent authority would be established within the polity, whose powers, personnel, and status would constitute a starting point for an institutional process that would shape, by itself and as itself, the balances required for the implementation of both principles of justice together. Let it be said from now on that the pure procedural process is necessarily closer to a suitable constitutional process between the primary institutions themselves, founded and operating on the basis of the two principles of justice, than a process between primary institutions from the field of liberty and background institutions from the field of substantive equality. The structured competition between the fourth authority as an elected, independent, and yet integrated and restrained institution with and by the other authorities, primarily against the executive authority in its utilitarian aspects, as well as the legislative body in these aspects. The allocation of roles, powers, and personnel in a way where a regulated and orderly process will exist. A real, clear, and legitimate rational struggle over the balanced character of society. This is a solution approaching both in theory and in practice toward the implementation of both principles of justice together in a pure procedural process, as far as can be in a human society, and in any case clearer and closer to this process than Rawls's proposal.